Welcome to Stories Found. Each week we feature funny, weird, and mostly true stories from writers, artists, and storytellers around the world. I'm your host, Ava Love Hannah, a writer and humorist from Austin, Texas. Joining me is my writing partner, audio engineer, and all-around cool guy, Paul Hannah. You're listening to Stories Found. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of Stories Found. In this episode, we'll be chatting with Austin-based playwright Max Langert and hearing his hilarious story, The First Time I Got Naked in Front of a Bunch of People I Didn't Know. Max has had plays produced in New York, Los Angeles, Boston, and Amsterdam. He's won the Henrico Playwriting Award, been named Best of the New Southern Theater Festival in Tennessee, and named Best of the Fest multiple times at FronteraFest in Austin. He's told stories at Testify, Austin Batcave, and Listen to Your Mother. He also manages Cinnamon Path Theater and has a couple of teenage sons that make him laugh a lot. I've had the privilege of knowing Max for a few years now, and he is an incredibly talented playwright, performer, and wonderful human, and I'm super excited to introduce you to him. Hey Max, thanks for joining us today to chat about your story. So, without giving too much away, go ahead and give us some info on what we're about to hear.
Sure. When I was in my 20s, I had an opportunity to live in Amsterdam for the summer. And a couple of friends of mine and I got invited to do something that ended up being pretty unique and sort of physically challenging for me. And that's what the story's about.
Okay. All right. So there are times that I've told a completely true story on stage, and I've still had audience members come up to me and assume it was fictional in some way. And I think that might be because I work in both fiction and nonfiction, or some things that have happened are just sort of over the top. And I know you've had similar situations as well. So let's just go ahead and clear the air. Is this story true or mostly true?
That's a great question. The story is definitely true, and the only hesitation you hear in my voice is little things like I'm like, well, were there 3 people in the room or 2 people?
Right.
I don't know if I got that right, but
right.
Yes, absolutely true.
I mean, this was only a couple of years ago, right? So
yeah, right. 2, 4, 6, 20.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so
very recently.
I think the most important question here, because when you sent the story over, we loved it, and I was up really late, and I was laughing so hard I was crying. So then immediately, my first thought as I laid in bed later was, well, the title of this story is The First Time I Got Naked in Front of a Bunch of People I Didn't Know. So, I mean, with that word first being there, was this the first of many times? Are we to assume there's a sequel?
Right. There may be a sequel. Some of the details are fuzzy,
right.
but I like to think that the reason I titled it that is out of optimism, sort of like, I'm willing to try this again.
So your whole perspective on it has changed, right? Instead of abject fear now, you're like, hey, if I get invited, I'll probably give it another shot.
There's some, maybe tweak things a little bit.
Right. Well, good to know. Good to know. I mean, so I've got this invite for you in case you were. No, I'm kidding.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for answering questions about your story. I'm super excited to share it with everyone. So without further ado, here is The First Time I Got Naked in Front of a Bunch of People I Didn't Know, by Max Langert.
When I was 25, I had this great opportunity to go to Amsterdam for the summer as part of a band that I was in with my 2 friends, Brendan and Valerie, who were a couple at the time. We were the house band at a comedy club called Boom Chicago, which has become sort of famous now, and we would go on after a couple of comedy shows in the evening, playing while people hung out and drank and whatever else. And we had sort of an Airbnb-like situation when we got there. We would live in an apartment for a week while the owners were out of town, and then move to another apartment where somebody was out of town, and so on and so on. And so we got to see a lot of different parts of the city. And once we had been to rehearsals and sort of had our routine down with the music and the club, we started to venture out and see some of the things that Amsterdam is famous for. We saw the canals, took boats down the canal, went to the red light district, which was just an eye-popping experience for me. visited some of the cafes that they're famous for, and visited Anne Frank's house, which was very sobering. And we also got invited to a spa that was in downtown. And there are a couple of notable things about this spa. One is that to get in, it's by invitation only. And the other thing is that you have to be naked in the spa the whole time you're there. It's a requirement. I had no interest in being naked in front of a bunch of people that I didn't know. In fact, it was a nightmare. It was like a nightmare scenario for me. In fact, it is the nightmare that people have, right? You just sort of show up somewhere and you're naked. But Brendan and Valerie were very excited about it. And I really admired Brendan and Valerie in a lot of ways, and I wanted to be more adventurous and open the way they were. And so when the three of us were invited to go to the spa, I said yes. And I figured I'd work up the courage to do it, that it would be important for me to do it. So as the day of our appointment approached, I got more and more anxious. And finally the day came when we were supposed to go, and Brandon and Valerie got on their bikes. We all had bikes. And we're like, all right, let's get going. And I looked at them and I said, you know what, guys, I just need a couple more minutes to kind of prepare myself. Why don't you go ahead and I'll meet you there. And they gave each other a look that I was familiar with and I recognized. And it was the look that said, Max isn't going to go. He's going to pretend he needs time to prepare and then come up with some excuse why he can't go. And that was fair because I often did that. And I often still do it. But I was determined to get to the spa. I felt that if I didn't go, it would be a failure of character. So I went up to our apartment, and the place we were staying at that point we were on the 4th floor of an 8-story apartment building. And it's one of these places that I associate with kind of, I don't know, middle-class European living. It's this big apartment complex, and there's a big courtyard in the middle, and everybody's got a balcony and an identical apartment. And when you look out the balcony, you can see all the other balconies of hundreds of other apartments, and there are, there's laundry hung out on lines on the balcony over railings to dry. People are sort of bustling around doing chores. And I figured I would get some practice being naked before I went to this spa. So I took off all my clothes and I sort of just walked back and forth in front of the balcony a few times. And I didn't hear anybody laughing, didn't see anybody pointing fingers or saying disparaging things, which helped raise my confidence level up. But there was this cat that was living with us in the apartment, the owner's cat, and it was a 3-legged cat. It had lost a leg, sadly, at some point. We had heard either falling or jumping or being thrown or something out of the apartment window. This cat hated us. It would pee on all our clothes when we weren't there. And anyway, just as I was wrapping up my back and forth naked walk, it jumped up to the counter next to me and it hissed at me violently. And I took that personally, and my confidence dropped back down. So I figured it might help to loosen me up a little bit if I had a drink before I went to the club. I figured everybody in Europe had alcohol in their apartment. So I scoured the place and all the cabinets looking for something to drink, but I couldn't find anything. And finally I looked under the kitchen sink and I found this really ancient bottle of cooking sherry. And I poured myself a small glass of that, and I drank it, and it was terrible, like the worst cough syrup ever. And then I poured another glass. I had that, and I started to feel lightheaded, and I thought, okay, now I'm ready to go to the spa. So I got on my bike, and I was hoping that I wouldn't be able to find the place, but I did find it. I saw where Brendan and Valerie's bikes were parked. And I went inside, and the receptionist was there, and she was super nice and everything, not naked. I don't know how she got away with that. And she gestured towards the dressing room. She said, why don't you go in there? You can leave all your stuff in there. And, all your stuff, everything in there. So I went in there and I got undressed. And the one sort of saving grace for me was that they allow you to bring a towel around. They supply a small towel. and you're not supposed to wrap it around your waist or anything. You just can have it nearby so that if you take a shower or jump in a pool or whatever, you have something to dry off with. And so I kind of tried to be very cool and savvy with this towel, and I would walk by, and as I would walk by somebody, I'd hold it up and be like, hey, how you doing? And then I'd switch hands as somebody came from the other side and hold the towel up above my waist. And I did that for a little while, very nervously. And eventually, as I walked around this quite large spa, it was 2 stories and just pretty extensive, I found Brendan and Valerie in this warm pool. They were together, and they saw me and they got excited and they gestured me over, come on in, you should get in this pool with us. And I sort of held the towel up and I slipped into the water. I was like, hey, and it was nice being underwater there. It was relaxing. They were happy and relaxed. Just kind of sat there. And then at some point, Brendan was like, yo, you got to put your feet up by the jets. There were these sort of jets of water that would spurt out. And in order to get to these jets, you had to kind of, push your body outside the water to reach them. And I sort of did it very quickly and sort of reached for the jets. I was like, oh, those are awesome. Sat back down and thought I was getting away with something. And then eventually the skin on Brendan and Valerie's fingers really pruned up when they decided to get out of the pool and go explore elsewhere. And I stayed in the pool until this naked guy came up and got into the pool with me. And I was like, I got to get out of this pool. And I kind of got up and I pulled the towel up and started walking around. And I was looking for things to do, and I felt a little bit like a criminal in one of these spy movies where I'm just trying not to be seen by anybody. Like I'm avoiding the cops, and I just would, go in a hallway and I'd see somebody and I'd sort of go somewhere else and, let me go behind this statue. And there are all these doors in these rooms with things in them. And I remember sort of poking around. I remember opening this door, and I opened up this door and there were like a bunch of naked people in there. And I was like, oh, I'm not going in there. I closed the door, grabbed my towel and kept walking. I eventually opened this door, and there were showers, and there was nobody in there. I thought, oh, I'll take a shower. And so I walked over and I took a shower, and I was like, hey, this is great. I love being in here. And then the door opened a couple minutes later, and this naked guy comes over and just starts taking a shower right next to me. And I'm like, God, what? It's like, grabbed my towel, walked out, and I looked around, and then I found another room that was a sauna room with like the really hot rocks, where you pour water over the rocks and the steam comes up. And so there was nobody in this room, and the rocks were hot, and I poured water over the rocks and it steamed up, and I poured more water and it got really, really steamy. And I sat down on this bench and I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool. And then like a couple minutes later, the door opens and these 2 naked women just start making a beeline for me and just sit down next to me. And I said, what world are we living in where 2 women who just sit next? I grabbed my towel, I walked out, and I was like, oh God, I was trying to kill time in this place being naked. And finally, Brendan came up to me at some point, and he's like, hey, do you want to maybe go upstairs and play chess? And I was like, yeah. And upstairs, they had this amazingly beautiful marble table with a built-in chessboard and all these marble pieces. And we started playing chess, and it was a really good distraction for me because I could focus a little bit anyway on the complexities of the game and not think about how naked I was. And we were sitting there, and after we were playing chess for a little while, this guy comes up to me, and he's standing just inches from my face, and he just folds his arm, and he's watching us play. And every time we would make a move, he would just be like, fascinating. And it wasn't fascinating at all. Brendan and I are mediocre chess players. Like, there's nothing to see here, And as we were playing, he just would inch closer and closer to my face. And at some point, I was just like, I have to blow the game. I have to get out of this. So I moved all my pieces away from my king, just trying to set Brendan up. And eventually, he checkmated. I moved my queen out of the way so like Brendan could checkmate. And the guy next to me was like, interesting move. It was Vladimir Putin, by the way. And I was like, yeah. And we ended the game, we got up, and then soon after that, Valerie came up to us. She's like, I think maybe I'm done. Maybe it's time to go home. And I was like, yeah, it's time to go home. I went back to the dressing room and got dressed again and went out to our bikes. And I looked at Brendan and Valerie, and they were glowing. They looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen them. So happy, And Valerie looks at us and she says, that was an amazing amazing experience. I mean, don't you just feel so good right now? And I felt the shirt on my back and the pants on my legs, and I was like, yeah, I feel really good right now. All right, thank you.
You've just heard The First Time I Got Naked in Front of a Bunch of People I Didn't Know by Max Langert. If you'd like to hear more of Max's work, make sure to check out his personal website, maxlangert.com, or his theater page, cinnamonpath.com. You can also find him on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll have a blog post with more information about Max, links to his social media pages, and some of his other work. You can find all of that on our website, storiesfound.com. Thanks for listening to Stories Found. We've been your hosts, Ava Love Hannah and Paul Hannah. Get more info about this week's episode, subscribe to our newsletter, or submit your own story and be a featured storyteller in a future episode. You can do all that and more on our website, storiesfound.com. Stories Found was recorded at ELA Studios deep in the heart of Austin, Texas.